Good afternoon, everyone. I'm in the enviable position of being able to talk a little bit about some solutions on a day when we've talked a lot about some of the lack of connection, the lack of humanity, and instead to talk about some of the areas of common humanity. The executive director of the Brotherhood Sister Soul. It's a comprehensive youth development organization. It's based in Harlem that works throughout the city. And we work on issues that directly coincide with the themes of Patch. A common humanity, responding to the crisis of a lack of connection by producing connection, and trying to seek out change strategies for young people. And so when I think about the lack of humanity, I often think about the humanity at the Brotherhood Sister Soul, or Bro Sis as we call it. We've been around for 20 years. We have 4 themes. Our themes are positivity, knowledge, community, and future. Again, you can hear a language, an ethos that directly connects to Patch and to its themes. Our theory of change is to provide for young people support, guidance, love, and education. And we never shy away from that word love. We embrace young people in love and in support and in guidance. We teach them to have discipline and order in their life, to develop the kind of agency that Pedro talked about earlier, so that they can have access and opportunities. So first, we encircle them with our arms. We provide the love and the support and guidance. But then we don't shy away from confronting this crisis, confronting the lack of connection, confronting the lack of humanity. And that's where the discipline and order comes in, the ability to push through so that they then can become social change makers in their own right. Our entire program is based on teaching morals and ethics to young people. A moral and ethical code. How will you live your life? What's your connection to your fellow brothers and sisters? And we teach that in a community context that directly speaks to a lack of humanity. So just a couple of statistics for context. They did the census in New York last year, and we found, to no surprise probably of all of us in the room, that in New York County, Manhattan, you have the greatest disparity of wealth in America. The top 5% earn $900,000 or more a year. The bottom 20% had an earned income of $10,000. That's the disparity here on this island. The population I work with is coming from that bottom 20% economically. That we allow that we allow 31% of the children in New York to be born into poverty is inhumanity in and of itself. It's a lack of connection to the humanity of these children, or we wouldn't stand for it. Yep. So our young people are being born into that context of poverty, and then they're attending a school system that is falling apart. Has fallen apart and never been repaired. They're attending a system where 400,000 children are at risk of failure, in a system of 1.1 million children. And where even the kids who graduate are not graduating college ready. Only 25% of the graduates in New York City graduate prepared for college without need of remedial support to matriculate to a community college. So if you take the population that I'm here talking about today, my young people I've worked with for 20 years at Brotherhood Sister Soul, and you talk about these 2 faces of inhumanity, poverty and a lack of opportunity to adequate education, then you see why we have a crisis. Our belief is that first our young people need to come to terms with their own humanity. They define what it means to be men and women, leaders, brothers and sisters in their community. They write mission statements about who they are as a collective. They write personal oaths of dedication on how they will live their life as moral and ethical decision makers, things that many adults have never done. First, so that they can claim their own humanity. Because if you're born into that kind of poverty, it's very easy to judge yourself harshly. If you're born into the polo grounds and you face that kind of poverty every day, and you see violence every day, it's very easy to think there's something wrong with you. If you define the word, you look up the word poverty in the dictionary, or poor, it's without value, lacking in worth, deficient. And so what we say to our young people is there's nothing deficient about you. You're of great worth. And first, it's a connection to their own humanity. It's a connection to their peer humanity. It's also a connection to their humanity as Black and Latino young people, their cultural heritage, their historical heritage. So part of it is about their own arc of a moral and ethical code. But the second piece that we think is central to reclaiming humanity, but also broadening the conversation around humanity, is to create social change makers. To create young people who see those conditions and fight back against them. We train them to be community organizers. We take them to spend a month in places like Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in Brazil, in Ghana, and South Africa, Why? Because it broadens their horizons as young people coming from that kind of poverty to become global citizens, but also they're creating connections as they travel all around the world with their peer groups, building levels of connection again. This morning, people talked about two traditional outgrowths, two things that we see in terms of young men and young women. With regards to young women, so often the silencing of voice, the inability of environments to create an environment, or the lack of attention to create an environment where girls' voices are celebrated. All too often we hear about boys having this warped image of masculinity and manhood. It's about hypermasculinity, it's about violence, it's about a lack of feeling. We don't see either of those two realities in brother and sister soul. We see young men who embrace love, who embrace definitions of manhood that are poetic and beautiful and about humanity and about connection. Two stories to illustrate these points. There's a group of young men, one chapter of the Brotherhood. They named themselves the Knowledge of Self chapter. So quite the opposite of running away from knowledge, the chapter calls itself the Knowledge of Self chapter. 15 young men, they came up in Harlem on the Lower East Side, and we would go on field trips together. And they'd be 16, 17 years old, wintertime, big puffy jackets on, Scullies, on the train, 15 of them, 2 male chapter leaders, invariably people on the train would be nervous. It was this group of 17 black and Latin young men. And then the train stop would come and everybody would start going their separate way, and all the brothers would pound each other up, and as they left said, "I love you." And you see the faces in the car change completely. They were stunned to see these black and Latin men saying goodbye to one another with words of love. That's commonplace in brother and sister soul. It's the environment we create, that you can claim an idea of manhood that's completely different from what you're inundated by media, by society, often what's taught in your community. There's a young woman, her name's Mercedes. We read President Obama's speech on race, the seminal speech he gave as he ran for his first term. It was celebrated in all corners of this country, derided in others, but in many celebrated. And we read it with her, and we were reading it because we wanted our young people to understand who this man was who was running for president, but also so that they could see the issues that he was dealing with. And there was a feeling of celebration in the room because there were powerful words in that speech. And when it was done and it came to Mercedes, she looked and said, "Why do I care about this? If he's elected, I'm still going to be poor." And in one simple sentence, she cut right to a reality. That there was this moment that many were celebrating, the election of a civil rights lawyer, a black man, came from a middle-class family to be president of the United States. But on another level, what would it do to the central issues that our young people were facing? She would still be on a block inundated by drugs. She would still be going to a school that was poor. All 3 of her brothers are incarcerated. She would still be facing a lack of opportunities that would not change for her on a daily lived way because somebody like Barack Obama was elected president. Her voice and the voice of young people throughout the organization are what's celebrated, but there's clearly an intentionality to ensure that young women have the space for their voices to be equally heard. Those are 2 areas of focus of the organization, but when I think about what we're trying to do in the end, I think probably about no alumni more centrally than some of the young men you'll hear from later today. They're called the Peace Poets. They graduated from our program. 5 young men, first in the family to go to college. 3 of them were educated here at NYU. And they used the spoken word to create channels of communication. They used the spoken word to counter violence, to go into schools in the Bronx and teach conflict resolution. They've been to 30 countries using the spoken word to connect in a human way with other people. They've done it in Colombia, in communities where people have been disappeared. They've done it in favelas in Brazil. They've gone south of the border in Mexico and done this work in communities where we have seen hundreds of women disappeared and killed and no response by the state simply because they are poor women. The idea is to create in young people the will to respond to the kind of conditions we've been talking about today, so that they can bring about more humanity, so that they can bring about more solutions, and so that they can actually be empowered to be the social change voices we need within this movement. About a month ago was the anniversary of Selma. Many of us talked about it with our young people. It was part of our curriculum. One of the central aspects of discussing Selma with our young people was the role of young people in the civil rights movement. Every effort in this country, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the movement for freedom and access of gay and lesbian people has been driven by young people. And the two examples we use within the movement, which a lot of times we lose sight of, are Martin King was 25 years old when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. 25 years old. The Freedom Riders were some of the bravest members of the civil rights movement. Only a few hundred actually got on those buses. And one was a woman named Diane Nash. And they had pushed and pushed and pushed so much that there was so much fear in D.C. that finally representatives of Robert Kennedy, when he was the Attorney General, called Diane Nash and said, "You cannot keep getting on these buses. It's creating too much controversy." She responded, "Not only are we getting on the bus, but we've written our last will and testament." She was 19 years old. So as we have the conversation, I just want to continue to make sure that we're looking at the role of young people in becoming the social change makers that we need as we advance this conversation. Thank you.